The first question we're tackling today is, how should I structure my chapter 3 in a mixed method study? Matthew, what can you tell us about structuring a mixed method study with qualitative and quantitative aspects as well?
Yeah, thanks, David. This is a great place for us to start our conversation here today because it allows me to say something that I say every time we do one of these. And I'll probably say several times today, which is always go back to your dissertation handbook when you have this kind of question to start. Because every university has a little bit of nuance in how they like those chapters to be pulled together. So, what I'm going to give you now is some general advice about kind of what to do if there isn't good detail in your dissertation handbook, but know that your dissertation handbook is your guiding document. That's what you should always default to for questions about formatting and structure. Now, if your dissertation handbook is quiet on this topic, what are we going to do? In a mixed method study, we're going to follow the same general structure for a chapter 3 that we would follow for quantitative or qualitative. So we're going to start with just sort of an introduction to the chapter. We're going to describe our research design. So you'll have a research design heading. Here you're going to say, this is a mixed method study. And here's part A and here's part B. And you're going to describe those. You're going to describe your population, sampling, all your participants. And if those are different between your quantitative and your qualitative elements, you're going to differentiate that using subheadings within that population and sample heading. You're going to talk about your data collection processes and instruments. So again, that becomes your level 1 heading or level 2 heading, depending on how you're structured. And then you have those subheadings underneath for my quantitative and my qualitative portion. Same thing for your analysis, your reliability and validity, all of those established sections in a chapter 3. You're still going to have them in the same order you would normally see them. We have a great template for that. By the way, if you're not really sure what that order should be, you can access our template. But then you're just going to bifurcate within the sections. This is my quantitative, this is my qualitative part. And usually we do write the quantitative part first, then the qualitative part when we're presenting that mixed method. So we start with the numbers and then we move to the words.
Just following on from that, what would you say are the key mistakes people do make when doing a mixed method study and structuring their chapter? What are some of the common issues that you see students and clients present with?
I would say one of the biggest challenges I see in a mixed method study is population and sample, because generally you have two different populations. So if you're doing quantitative, you might have data from 500 people, let's say employees in a hospital, but you're not going to interview 500 people. You're going to interview maybe the nursing managers only, and that might be 10 people. That's two separate populations. And so you have to make sure that that is very clear to the reader, that you have two separate populations that you're working with. The other thing I would say is I have a lot of clients who tend to write a lot about the part that they like the best. So we're all a little more quantitative, a little more qualitative. Most of the research I've published has been mixed methods, but I'm more of a qualitative guy. Really, that's what I really enjoy digging into more. So it's easy for us to spend more time in that qualitative discussion because that's what we like, but you've got to give equal airtime to that quantitative part if you're doing mixed methods. So making sure that you're treating both equally and you're not showing favoritism toward one part of your methodology, I think that's important balance.
I think the only thing that I would add there is one big methodological issue that I see when I'm working with clients is specifically not justifying sufficiently. And that's justifying based on the literature, but also justifying based on your research design, your research questions. So structurally, we always end up putting the content first and then we justify. So for every decision that you make sure there's a sentence to 3 sentences up to a paragraph. If it's a big decision point that you clearly indicate why you've made the choice you have. And even then, if you've got space and word count to play with, you can also do a little bit of engagement with what are alternative options you could have done and why those aren't relevant. But again, that's if you've got word count to spare. Habiba asked, if I'm doing a systematic review, what are the essential fundamentals I need to get right first? Matthew, systematic reviews are frustrating even for seasoned researchers. What secrets can you tell us about how to get it right from the get go?
Yeah, I just saw a study recently, just the other day, that said that the average systematic review takes 9 months to complete. So it is a huge undertaking to do a systematic review. And I think your question here is really wise, Abiba, because it's all about how do we start? How do we get those
Yeah.
fundamentals in place so that as we're on this lengthy journey to create a systematic review, we stay on track? The key element here is the word systematic. Systematic reviews rely on a system and a structure. And so you have to take time to build a thoughtful system for how you are going to run your review. And the more time you spend up front really designing that system, the easier your review is going to be. So you need to take time up front to decide what tools you're going to use, what databases you're going to reference, what keywords you're going to track, how you're going to log all of the literature you're bringing in. We have a great literature catalog tool here at Grad Coach that we like to share. Being able to log all of that so you can keep track of it. Being able to log your searches because you're not going to do all of your searches at once. So being able to have a process to say, on May 26th, I used this database and these three keywords and I got 27 articles. And then next week when I search again, I know where I left off. Those kinds of processes and really documenting all of that up front makes your whole journey easier. Remember that you're going to have to write about that process, and you might be writing about that process 6 months from today. And so if you document it well now, it will make that process easier. I'd also love to share with you a tool that I love for systematic reviews, and this is called Elicit. Elicit is an AI search engine for scientific research. So they go through and they find the papers most relevant to your topic and kind of present those to you. They build out these really cool tables so that you can sort through the findings really easily. I'm recommending this to almost all of my clients when they're working through systematic review processes or lengthy literature review processes as well. I just find that it really makes the process much faster because it's looking across multiple databases in one search. So I would definitely encourage you checking that one out.
So, thinking about this, how do we know we're on the right track when we're doing the systematic review? What are the key things we have to keep in mind during the systematic review process, Matthew?
I think the biggest challenge to systematic review is content drift. It's very easy as you work through your review to allow yourself to drift away from whatever it is that you set out originally to study. So that's again why it's so important that we create those strong systems up front to track our work, that we brainstorm those strong keywords up front so that when we start adding new keywords later, which is normal, that's going to happen because you're going to find new keywords, but we're able to kind of go, does this keyword match the other ones? And are we still moving on the right path? Then the other big mistake I see is not cataloging the literature along the way.
Mm.
So a lot of times we end up just dumping it into a folder. My rule is I never dump more than 10 into a folder before I stop and catalog. That seems to work well for me. 10 feels like a manageable number. Eventually, you're going to have 50, you might have 100, you might have 500 articles in your systematic review, depending on what your topic is and how heavily it's been studied. And if you wait until after you found the articles to start cataloging and breaking them down, you're never, like 500 is just going to be too big of a mountain. It's going to feel insurmountable, and it probably will be. It's going to just crush you. You're going to move on. So set a goal for yourself, whether it's 10 articles, maybe it's 15 articles, maybe for you it's 3 or 5 articles feels more comfortable. We're going to pull those. We're going to catalog along the way.
I think that's really helpful advice. The other bit of advice that I'd offer is whenever you are making any decisions about keeping literature or choosing not to include literature, make a note of that. So keep a regular note while you're doing your systematic review of what information you find about a paper, what information you thought was relevant, and also for papers that you found that fit your search strategy, that matched your title, you need to have a justification for why that wasn't included. Most of the time, they're not going to ask you for that information, but you might have a supervisor or a committee member who's going to ask you those questions. So what I suggest is, along with your literature catalog, keep a spreadsheet that is just the title of the paper, the information about the paper, and then specifically your notes on it. So that's really helpful if you're using something like a Prisma diagram. That's going to help you indicate what was removed at each stage of your systematic review process as well. Going to our third question from Rosaline, she's looking for advice on structuring their introduction chapter. What is the best format for an introduction chapter for a PhD thesis in monograph form? Now, Matthew, if you can first let us know what's a monograph and how does that differ from something else? And then secondly, any advice you can provide on structuring that. And I have a sneaking suspicion you're going to mention the template guidelines from the university as well.
You know me well, David. So I'm definitely going to start there. We always go to our guidelines from the university first. But if you don't have those guidelines, here's some things to think about. First, what is a monograph dissertation? So monograph dissertation is when we have one complete study in our dissertation. It's what a lot of people think about as more of a traditional dissertation, where it's one study, 5 chapters, and we move through the dissertation process. This is different than some universities. There's a couple of different models of dissertations. So there's action research dissertations where you are implementing changes and then you're monitoring those over cycles and writing about that change cyclically over time. There's also portfolio style dissertations. They have different names, but basically you would publish papers and then those papers would be woven together. There might be an introduction chapter and a conclusion chapter to kind of bookmark it. That it would be more of a portfolio of published work. But we're talking today about really that 5-chapter dissertation, that sort of standardized structure. In your chapter 1, this is your introduction chapter, and this is where you're going to really just lay out all the key ideas for your reader and your committee. So we start with a simple introduction. We give a little bit of background, not a lot of detail here, but we do include some citations. We're including some literature, just enough to help the reader understand where we're going. We're going to state our problem in and out really quick, 1 to 2 paragraphs, very direct. The problem this dissertation seeks to solve is, and we're going to fill in the blank. The same thing for a purpose. We're going to do a 1 or 2 paragraph purpose statement. We're going to state our research questions and our hypotheses if we're doing that quantitative work and we have null hypotheses we have to address. We're going to identify the theories and the conceptual frameworks. We're going to write about those here and help the reader understand what theories we're borrowing from, what frameworks we're leaning on as we design the rest of our study. And then the most important part, we're going to explain why this study matters. We're going to include a significance section. This is why this study matters. This is the gap that it fills in. And this is how we hope to move the field forward. You might also include a definition section in your chapter 1. Some universities require that, some discourage that. So there's a little flux there in my experience. And then, of course, just a simple conclusion on the way out. This is what we talked about in this chapter. Remember that dissertation writing is its own genre. And so you're going to break a lot of rules from other writing genres that you've learned. We're going to repeat ourselves a lot. We're going to forecast a lot. And so you want to always make sure you have that strong conclusion that wraps everything up and forecasts your chapter 2.
I think the other thing that's sometimes added, and again, this is something that differs between institutions, is right at the end is a sort of outline of the chapters that follow, a paragraph that just says the literature review will follow and will cover the following aspects and move through each of your chapters. But again, that does differ between institutions. So if you ever find yourself uncertain, a really good rule of thumb is to look at previous dissertations that have been published in the form you're doing, whether that's a monograph or manuscript by publications. And there you want to check what are the specific norms for your department, because again, that differs substantially. Myself, for instance, I did a PhD by publication. So I had different chapters and then had this very interesting introduction and discussion that had to pull together 3 or 4 different experimental studies. So it really does differ. So always checking those guidelines is super important. And if your university isn't the kind that's giving you great guidelines, take a look at those previous examples as well. But to dig a little bit deeper, Matthew, you mentioned a few sections in the introduction, and I think one that's really important is the significance section. Can you give any advice on what are the specific things that we should be covering in there other than saying, this is the literature gap? Because I know a lot of students suffer with that section feeling like they don't know what to put in.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think of all the sections in chapter one, this is the section that is the most abstract.
Mm,
And also, I think the section that has the widest gap in university expectations. So, the difference
mm,
from university to university. So, some general rules. First, we are going to start that section with the gap. We're going to say very clearly the gap in the literature is blank. And here's how I came about that. You're going to kind of forecast what's going to be in your chapter two. You're going to talk about this in detail in your chapter two. And so this is where it gets tricky because a lot of people feel like they've written too much or too little in this section, knowing that that chapter two is coming. So I generally say 1 to 2 paragraphs about your gap is where you should start until your advisor tells you otherwise.
mm.
Then we pivot from the gap into being able to say, here's how I'm filling the gap. And that is really the significance, right? So the significance of your paper is how you fill the gap in the literature in order to move your industry, in order to push your sector forward. So once you identify the gap, you're going to say, here's how I fill it. And you're going to mention all the ways that you fill it. You might fill the gap by your population and sample. You might fill it by your methodology. You might fill it by your sample size. You might fill it by your paradigm. Maybe you have, maybe it has only been studied through case studies and observation, and you're really doing the first experiment. That would be a way to fill the gap. And so you're talking about how your study fills the gap in as much detail as you can, and then how filling that gap will improve the industry. So that's sort of the third part. So we've identified the gap. We talk about how we're filling the gap, and then how or why does filling the gap move everyone forward? Why is that good for everyone that we fill the gap? So that's 3 to 5 paragraphs, I would say, for that section. Really, 1 paragraph for each of those 3 components is probably sufficient until your advisor tells you otherwise.
I think that's great advice, especially the idea of keeping it short and focused and to the point. I think that's probably a risk that many students find themselves in is that they over explain in the introduction and then they get worried in the literature review. So Zane is tackling that age-old question. What's the difference between the background in my introduction and the background in my literature review? Matthew, what can you tell us about those differences? Because I know I struggled as well when I was doing my first dissertation.
For sure. So the difference here is really detail and depth. So your content is largely the same because the background is the background. The history is the history. But in your chapter one, we're writing 2, maybe 3 paragraphs about the background to start. Again, your advisor might push you in a different direction based on your university's expectations. But we're trying to give you the highlights. You're the reader. I need you to know this, 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 and this. These are the things that have happened that have led to this point. In my literature review, I'm going to go into each of those points in much more detail. So in chapter one, I'm saying this is a thing that happened. In chapter two, I'm saying this is a thing that happened. Here's what we learned about it. Here's how it came to be. Here are the people who studied it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what might be a sentence or two in chapter one is likely a subheading of multiple paragraphs in your chapter two.
I think that's really helpful, especially when we think about those differences. Another way to think about it is, as Matthew said, it's the highlights in the introduction and it's the critical analysis. It's the review in the literature review. That's where those buzzwords that you hear, critical writing, synthesis, bringing that all together, that comes into play in the literature review, where you've got to really engage with how you came to that finding, that highlight that you've mentioned. So for our next question, Petra raised some concern about the length of sections in their literature review. Her question is, how short is too short for a literature review subsection before it looks weak? Matthew, I know this is a struggle that we all face when we're questioning, have I done enough? What advice can you give about the length of subsections in the literature review And what sort of things can students look out for?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one. There's a little bit of some professional intuition that has to go into this answer. So the first thing I'm going to say is if you're looking at it and it just feels too short and you've got that nagging feeling that it's too short, it's probably too short. And so think about how can I expand the depth of that. A couple of other just sort of general rules. So most dissertations that most of our clients are using the APA style guide. So it's important to remember that under the APA style guide, it takes 3 sentences to make a paragraph. And so if you have less than 3 sentences, that's too short by default. So think about that. And I would also venture to say 3 sentences is almost always too short in a literature review as well. But 3 sentences is the cutoff. So if you've only got 2 sentences in a paragraph, that is too short by definition. You need to flush that out. Another way to think about it, rather than thinking about length, I like to think about citation density. So looking at how many citations are there within that individual section or paragraph. A lot of my clients fall into what I call single author syndrome, where they say, this author said this, then this author said this, and this author said this. And there's no synthesis there. There's no critical thought there. And what happens is we blend those together. We increase that citation density by pulling in new authors to our conversation. That makes our conversation richer and deeper and automatically longer. So when we're really doing that deep synthesis, we're checking to make sure we have lots of citations within each paragraph. I would say no paragraph should have fewer than 3 authors. That's sort of a general rule that I like to apply. Of course, there's exceptions to every rule, but that's sort of a quick check that I challenge a lot of my clients to start with. Are there at least 3 authors in each paragraph in my literature review? That's when you start to get into that deeper level of conversation with the literature and analysis with the literature. And once you're doing that, you're automatically writing more. And so you start to worry less about the length and the word count. The last thing I would say, carefully consider your heading structures, because a lot of times things look truncated because of the way you've organized it. And so it might actually be appropriate in length and in depth and in citation density, but look short because you've added a subheading that you don't really need there. That maybe we could take some subheadings out. Maybe we could rename a subheading earlier in the paper that might capture 3 or 4 sections and push them into one so that it feels a little meatier. That's where that intuition comes into play, because let's be honest, there is a sort of skim check that your readers are going to do. As a coach and as a professor, when I was doing that, I always skimmed the paper before I read the paper. And if I'm seeing lots of subheadings with just one paragraph, subheading one paragraph, subheading one paragraph, that does raise alarm bells to me, that then I'm going to look a little deeper and a little more carefully at those sections. So think about, do I have the right subheadings? Are there too many subheadings? Are my subheadings making my work look artificially short?
The other bit of advice I can get is get a second opinion. Maybe not your supervisor or chair if you're not ready to submit it to them, but get a friend to read it. Get anyone to take a look at it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a professor or a lecturer, but if they look at it and they start saying, this feels a bit choppy, or I'm not sure if you've gone into enough detail, that's a clear sign that you do need to dig deeper. And again, as Matthew said, it's really about thinking about your structure and your outline. And that's why it's so important to outline early in the process to build a structure. And then once you're in the writing process, don't feel locked into your structure either. That's a huge mistake that I've experienced many times with clients, is they feel locked into the structure that they've developed. Structures don't survive contact with the literature. I'm paraphrasing, I think it's Sun Tzu, but it's really an important factor. You've always got to iterate on the writing process. We plan, we write, we review, we rewrite, we review again, we rewrite again. So it's definitely not a straight shot. If you can do the dissertation straight shot, then you are an amazing writer. Please give me the tips that I'm looking for, because it is not the easiest process. We're looking at a question that Nico submitted, and they said, should I send my supervisor messy drafts or wait until everything is polished? Matthew, what are your thoughts here on when to send the draft to this dreaded supervisor?
Yeah, so that supervisor relationship is a really delicate one, and one that a lot of our clients have a hard time kind of navigating. So, a couple of thoughts on this. First, I would never say to send a messy draft to your supervisor. And I have been a supervisor. As a supervisor, I'm very hands on. As a coach, I'm very hands on. As a coach with Grad Coach, I'm okay with a messy draft because I'm your friend, I'm your partner getting you through. As a supervisor, I'm also okay with it, but I want to see that you've done the work, right? It's a different mindset. And so, messy is a spectrum. I think it's okay to send work to your supervisor if it's like 80% of the way there, but definitely not like 30% of the way there. We want to get pretty close to the end. And I actually advise my clients often to send their manuscripts in at that 80% mark because it leaves room for your supervisor to weigh in. And some supervisors really want to do that. Some supervisors really want to get their hands dirty and get into your paper and provide that deep feedback. Some don't. Some want perfect drafts and they don't want to have to get their hands dirty. And so you have to vibe that out a little bit with your supervisor. But I think that 70 to 80% mark, I think that's a safe place to send stuff in. Ultimately, you need to have that conversation with your supervisor. That's part of building the supervisor relationship is setting those clear expectations. In addition to paper cleanliness, I would also say cadence of submission is also very important. So if your advisor wants to see a draft every other Friday, I think it's very important that you hit that every other Friday deadline, even if it's a little messier, because that shows a level of respect and responsibility to your advisor. It shows that you're making progress, and your advisor is probably going to be more helpful to you if you're hitting those benchmarks, even if your work is still a little messy, than if you're missing those benchmarks striving for perfection. The last thing I will say is that perfection is not a thing, especially in dissertation land. You are probably not going to like your dissertation when it's done. That's a hard reality. It's a hard truth. I am not happy with mine 12 years out. Please do not go on the internet and find it. I mean, you can, but it is not my best work because it's really my first work, right? And so it's not supposed to be your best work. You're not going to be happy with it. There's always going to be typos. There's always going to be errors. There's always going to be things looking back. Perfection is not a thing in dissertation land. So don't wait for perfection to turn your stuff in because then you're never going to turn your stuff in and then you're never going to be a doctor.
I think that is so true. And it's something I struggled with myself as well. When is the right time to hand it in? I was fortunate that I had really good communication and relationship with my main supervisor. So he knew what we were both looking for. In my case, my supervisor was really clear that she wanted progress. She didn't want perfection. So in that case, I did that conversation early on. I asked them up front, what are you looking for when you're expecting a draft from me? So it's really important to have that conversation. The other thing that you can do is talk to other students who have been supported by that supervisor. They can give you an idea of what the expectations are. And lastly, do make sure that you are also following the institutional expectations as well. Working with a range of students at Grad Coach, we know that there are some courses where they limit the number of submissions you can do. That's a whole different story. If you've got
Mhm.
limited submissions, you want to get the most bang for your buck. So you really want to give them as higher quality, not perfection, as Matthew said, nothing's perfect, but you want to then be giving them as much to work with. But if you've got a constant engagement with your supervisor, if they're working with you throughout the process, that's a very different story. Have the conversation, speak to them about their needs and expectations, and then stick to those as well. The last bit of advice I'll give here is sometimes it can be helpful to not send that messy draft if you've got an upcoming deadline where they're looking for something and you don't want to submit that draft that you don't feel is ready. But don't not submit something. Give them a clear outline, a very detailed outline if you can. That shifts the focus. Obviously, speak to them before you do so, because if you give them an outline when they're expecting a full draft, they're going to be unhappy. But you want to then do what you can to get their feedback without losing that opportunity as well. But again, every relationship with a supervisor is unique and different. So make sure you are communicating well with them. Assuming that's going well, you will then be able to follow their expectations. And that's really what you want to be doing. In many cases, they're your marker. They're the ones who are giving you the green stamp and giving you that doctorate. So you want to keep them happy as well. We've got a question that was submitted by Ruth. So she's working on the literature review for her master's, has done the groundwork and settled on some papers. She's looking for advice on how to efficiently read and use the studies. Matthew, what advice do you have for effectively reading papers and getting the most out of that time that you're spending with the paper?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, something that we tackle a lot with our grad coach clients. So the first thing I would say is we never read a research paper top to bottom. I don't know that I've ever read a research paper top to bottom since I learned not to do that, because they're not really designed to be read that way, right? These aren't books. They aren't magazine articles. They're collections of information. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to skim that article. We're going to get a feel for where all of the pertinent information is. Then we have to think about what is our purpose for reading this article, because that purpose for reading the article helps direct where in the article you need to read and where you need to focus your attention. If your purpose is you're trying to understand the background and the history of your topic, then that's going to be housed in a literature review. And we're going to read lots of literature reviews. If you're trying to understand the outcome of a certain intervention, for example, maybe you've got 15 articles about a certain intervention, then we're going to focus our attention more heavily on that method section and that result section so we can understand how things were studied and what the studies found. If we're trying to think about practical implications, maybe we're working on that section of our literature review where we're thinking about like the practitioner side of an issue. We see that a lot like with our MBA students and our doctors of business administration clients who are trying to think about how we apply things. Then we're going to look at that discussion and that conclusion section where the authors are really trying to say, here's why this matters in the real world. So I think we want to think about what information do we need to pull from this article, and then almost it's like a hunting expedition. We're going to go find that information rather than just reading the article top to bottom. The other part of this is really taking careful, organized notes and using a note catcher that allows you to catalog this information. And what I always tell people when they get from the notes to the writing, because that's a heavy metacognitive lift. In your notes, you're going to take all of those notes. I like to do this in a spreadsheet. We take all those notes in a column, and then we're going to code all those notes by theme. Then I can sort my spreadsheet by theme. Those themes become subheadings. My notes become paragraphs. I paraphrase from my notes into my manuscript. That's how I get my rough draft. And then from there, I polish, I reorganize, I rewrite until I have a product that I'm happy with.
I think that is perfect advice. Really, that point that you made at the end of taking the information from the paper, putting it into notes, and then paraphrasing it back into content for your document. That is going to be the key that's going to help you avoid plagiarism and issues like that, because that's a common issue that many students face is they say, but how do I put this in my own words when Johnson et al. 2024 put it perfectly? And the process is taking that information, taking it in, chewing on it, working through it, taking down the notes of those key points and ideas, and then paraphrasing it out. So just a little bit further advice based on what Matthew said is when you know what you're looking for in a paper, set up a structure in your catalog. So have it that this is the key goal of the paper. This is the methodology that they use. This is the finding that they found. So you plan out what information you want to collect, and then you synthesize and summarize that. And then the next step for the literature review writing process is then looking for those connections between those papers as well. So you want to say, okay, I'm interested in the effectiveness of this educational intervention on school children. You're going to look at 4, 5, 10 papers that have all used that intervention. And then you're going to say, how many found a positive intervention? How many found a negative intervention? If there were differences, what differed between those studies. So again, you want to be thinking about what it is that you're trying to achieve when you're making those notes for the paper. If it's for the literature review, you're trying to build out an argument. You're trying to show what's been done already and how the gaps in it are feeding into your study as well. I think that's all the time we have for questions today. So I really want to thank you all for submitting questions before. I also want to thank Matthew for the great wisdom that he shared with us, particularly telling us about the hard truths as well. I know for me, I am not happy with my dissertation either. I wish I could go back and change it. There are 3 or 4 mistakes that I feel are absolutely glaring, but it's important to note that that's okay. You are not making your magnum opus. You are not creating the perfect paper. It's got to meet that benchmark to get the pass, but that's really where it is. So for those of you that found this really helpful and are interested in potentially working with one of our coaches, you can use the following link there or the QR code to book a free 15-minute consultation. In that consultation, the coach is going to work with you to help you identify what your issues are, what are your difficulties, and then they're going to help build a plan and suggest how they can provide support. So if you're interested in that, please do use that QR code or book a session using the link gradcoach.me/QA.